Welcome back, everybody. Today we're going deep on an interview with Yosha Bah.
Oh, yeah.
He's a cognitive scientist and AI researcher with some really interesting thoughts about AI intelligence and even what it means to be human.
Yeah, I think Bob's background is really fascinating because he combines expertise in computational methods with a deep understanding of philosophy.
Yeah.
He even talks about how growing up in East Germany shaped his views, especially on knowledge and authority.
It seems like that definitely gave him a different perspective.
Yeah.
One of the things that really stood out to me was his take on the term artificial intelligence. He actually suggests that we should be calling it advanced information processing.
That's a good point. I think he argues that the current focus on artificial intelligence leads us to focus too much on raw computing power, like what he calls brute force, and that we're missing a crucial element of true understanding.
Yeah, and he uses a really great example to illustrate this. A simulated world that somebody built in Minecraft, where they tried to program the AI to understand water, how to get wet.
Interesting.
But it just didn't work. The AI couldn't grasp this concept that seems so simple to us.
It's a pretty humorous example.
Yeah.
But it really highlights how our assumptions about intelligence can be misleading. We tend to project our own human experience onto AI, but these systems might be operating on entirely different principles.
So how do we move beyond these assumptions?
Well, Bach suggests that we need to look deeper beyond just the surface level of processing power.
Yeah.
He brings up some classic thought experiments like the Chinese room to explore this idea of understanding. In the Chinese room, somebody who doesn't speak Chinese follows instructions to manipulate symbols, which ends up giving the illusion of understanding the language.
Yeah, this is a classic thought experiment in the field, and John Searle originally used it to argue that computers can't truly understand language, only simulate it.
Right.
But Bach actually disagrees with that.
He does. He argues that it's not about the physical implementation. The person inside the room might not understand Chinese, but the system as a whole, with its rules and its logic, demonstrates a kind of understanding. He compares it to a word processor, like the software. The patterns are what matters, not the specific hardware it's running on.
So it's the structure, the relationships within the system that matter.
Right.
That's a really interesting take on the Chinese room.
And then he connects this to another famous thought experiment, Mary's room, where Mary knows everything about color scientifically,
Right.
but she's lived her entire life in a black and white room.
Yeah.
The question is, would she learn something new by actually experiencing color?
That's a great question. That really gets to the difference between knowing about something and actually experiencing it firsthand.
Yeah.
It makes you wonder if there's something fundamental that AI might be missing.
And that's exactly what Bach dives into. He suggests that AI could potentially overcome this limitation, maybe even exceeding the limitations of the human experience.
Yeah. Okay, so how does he think that's possible? What's his take on this whole concept of consciousness?
He views consciousness as a learning algorithm. For humans, it's essential for our development and how we interact with the world.
But he doesn't think machines need consciousness to be intelligent.
That's right. He actually poses the question, could AI achieve intelligence by skipping consciousness altogether, developing understanding through different means?
So he's saying that consciousness may not be a prerequisite for intelligence.
Exactly. And he even suggests that consciousness itself might be much simpler than we assume.
Simpler. What does he mean by that?
Well, he wonders if we might find evidence of consciousness in other life forms, like insects or plants operating on vastly different timescales than our own.
So if consciousness is just an algorithm, a biological program, could we replicate it in a machine? And if we did, would that be true AI or just a really good simulation?
Those are really big questions. And Bach doesn't shy away from them. He proposes 7 levels of mental development.
7 levels.
Yeah, expanding on a model by Robert Keegan, who is a developmental psychologist. Okay.
And he's particularly interested in levels 6 and 7, which he calls the enlightened mind and the transcendent mind. These levels deal with ideas of consciousness, self-awareness, even enlightenment.
Enlightenment. That sounds pretty far out there for an AI researcher.
It might sound unusual, but it actually ties into some deep philosophical concepts.
Yeah.
He connects these higher levels of consciousness to the Buddhist concept of Maya, which is the illusion of reality.
Okay.
He sees enlightenment as this process of deconstructing the illusion of self and finding deeper meaning.
This is where things start to get really interesting. He even compares this idea to a thought experiment called Samsara by Scott Alexander, which suggests that there might be value in staying engaged with the seemingly meaningless aspects of human life.
Right. It's a fascinating contrast. On the one hand, you have this idea of enlightenment transcending the illusion of self. And on the other hand, you have this idea that maybe meaning is found in the messy, imperfect reality that we experience. It makes you think about how AI, which might not be burdened by those same illusions, could potentially achieve a level of understanding that we can't even grasp.
That's a pretty profound thought. And it leads to some even bigger questions about the future of human intelligence as AI continues to develop.
And that's exactly where we're headed next. We'll be exploring Bach's thoughts on the potential trajectories of human intelligence, the idea of the Übermensch, and the possibility that AI could either exacerbate or help us overcome the existential risks that we're facing.
It's a conversation you won't want to miss. Stay with us as we continue this deep dive into Yosha Bach's perspective on AI consciousness and the future of intelligence.
So we've been talking about Yosha Bah's ideas about AI consciousness and even enlightenment. But he doesn't just stay in the theoretical realm.
Right.
He really gets into the implications of AI for the future of humanity.
Yeah, one of the things I find so interesting about his work is that he's not afraid to tackle the big questions even when they're unsettling.
Yeah.
He even suggests that our current civilization might not be sustainable in the long run.
Wow, that's a pretty serious statement. What makes him think that?
Well, he points to things like our unsustainable consumption patterns, the threat of existential risks, and he makes this comparison between humanity and a swarm of locusts consuming everything in their path, leading to their own collapse.
That's a powerful image. But where does he see AI fitting into all of this?
Well, he doesn't really give us like a simple answer. He's skeptical of the utopian and dystopian views about AI. You know, he doesn't think AI will necessarily lead to some kind of singularity or that it's definitely going to destroy us.
So he doesn't think that the Terminator scenario is going to happen?
Not exactly. He sees AI as something that is fundamentally different from human intelligence, not just a more advanced version of ourselves.
Right.
He really challenges that idea of the Übermensch, like the superhuman successor to humanity.
So instead of AI being the next step in human evolution, he sees it as something completely new that we can't really predict or control.
I think that's a good way to put it. And he says that this uncertainty is what makes things so interesting. He talks about how we were objectively more comfortable than ever before in human history, with lower risks of death from things like disease, hunger, or violence.
But he's not convinced that this comfort is going to last.
Yeah, that's it.
Right.
He argues that this comfort might come at a cost. He seems to be saying that our way of life, our constant drive for more, might actually be our undoing.
So you're saying that this sense of existential dread that we're seeing that many people feel is actually a symptom of how successful we've become? We're so busy consuming that we've lost sight of what comes next.
I think that's a good point. And what's really interesting is that Bach believes AI could help us address this.
Really?
He doesn't just see it as a threat, but as a potential solution.
Okay, I'm really curious about that. How does he think AI could help us?
He reminds us that AI is a technology for solving problems using better information and more efficient methods. He believes that AI will ultimately solve more problems than it creates. But he stresses that we need to harness its power wisely.
So instead of being afraid of AI, we should see it as a powerful tool to help us deal with the problems that humanity is facing, like climate change and resource depletion.
That's exactly it. He talks about a future where AI augments our intelligence, helps us expand our capabilities, and even builds stronger connections with each other and the world around us.
That's a really different vision of AI than what we usually hear about. But it also makes you think about control and agency, like if we're all using AI, who's really making the decisions.
Yeah, and this is where his ideas about the levels of mental development come back in. He thinks that AI could actually help us reach those higher levels of understanding where we move past the limitations of our individual selves and connect to something much bigger.
So it's not about humans versus AI, but humans and AI evolving together.
Exactly. And he even suggests that we might need to develop safeguards to make sure that AI stays in line with human values and goals as it continues to grow.
So it's more about a partnership between humans and AI.
Right.
But how do we actually get from where we are now to that kind of future?
Well, Bach warns us against just blindly pursuing brute force approaches like scaling up deep learning models without a deeper understanding of how intelligence actually works.
So we need to be smarter about how we design and train these systems instead of just throwing more data and computing power at them.
Right. He encourages us to look for other approaches, maybe drawing inspiration from the efficiency and elegance of the human brain.
Okay.
He thinks we need to move beyond just replicating patterns and data and towards AI systems that can actually understand and reason about the world in a much deeper way.
So we need to move from advanced information processing to something closer to true artificial intelligence.
Exactly. But creating machines that can really understand and experience the world in that way brings up some big ethical questions.
That's a good point. What does he say about that?
He emphasizes that creating AI that is not only intelligent, but also ethical and aligned with human values is crucial.
So it's not just about making machines that are smarter, but machines that are also wise and compassionate.
Exactly. And he thinks this will require a big change in how we think about AI. Instead of seeing it as a tool for domination or control, we need to start thinking about it as a partner in our own evolution.
That's a pretty big shift.
Yeah.
And it makes me wonder, what can we actually do to make sure that AI develops in a way that benefits humanity? What does this partnership actually look like?
Well, that's a big question, and one that we're probably going to be trying to answer for a long time, but I think Bach's work gives us a great framework for thinking about it.
I agree. His perspective is both challenging and inspiring.
Right.
He wants us to think about the potential of AI while understanding the risks that come with it. But before we finish up, there's one more thing I wanted to touch on. He talks about this idea of gods as multi-mind selves that are implemented across multiple brains.
That's right. It's definitely a mind-bending idea, and I think it speaks to the potential for intelligence to exist beyond the level of the individual. He uses this idea of gods to show how complex multi-mind systems can form and impact the world.
So it's not just about individual minds, but also about collective intelligence.
Yeah.
Maybe even hive minds. It makes you think about how AI could lead to even more complex and interconnected forms of consciousness, than we can imagine right now.
And he even compares these gods to the way that viruses or pandemics spread.
Okay, that's an interesting connection. How does that work?
He's highlighting how ideas or memes can spread through a population and change our beliefs and behaviors. Just like a virus can spread quickly and affect a lot of people, certain ideas can take hold and really influence our thinking on a massive scale.
That makes me think about social media and how the algorithms choose what we see and what we believe.
Yeah.
You can feel like we're not really in control of our own thoughts, but that we're just caught up in all this information that we don't even realize is influencing us.
I think that's a really important point, and this is where Bach stresses how important individual agency is. He recognizes the power of these larger systems, these multi-mind systems. But he also says that it's important for us to work on our own understanding. We need to be questioning things and making conscious decisions about how we deal with this complex world.
So it's not about giving up, but about becoming more aware and more intentional with our actions and thoughts.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Especially with technology like AI that could change the world so much.
It sounds like a call to action, to take responsibility for how intelligence evolves.
I think so, but let's get back to some more practical takeaways from Bach's work for a moment.
Okay, good idea. What are some things that people can take away from this?
Well, one of the key things is to understand the limitations of how we're approaching AI right now. He says that just using more data and processing power isn't going to get us to real artificial intelligence. We need to come up with new ways to approach this challenge.
So what can we do?
He wants us to think about intelligence in a more well-rounded way. We need to think about the ethical implications and make sure these systems match up with human values. He also wants to remind us that we are part of this story and that we have the power to shape how intelligence evolves. It's up to us to decide what role we want to play in that.
That's a powerful message, and I think a good place to stop this part of our conversation. We've covered a lot from consciousness to the future of human intelligence.
It's been a fascinating look at some really complex ideas, and there's still more to explore.
For sure. In the next part of this episode, we'll dive into some of the philosophical implications of Bach's work, especially his ideas about enlightenment and finding meaning in a world that's increasingly shaped by AI. Yeah. We've been spending some time with Yosha Bach's ideas about AI and what it means for humanity, and it's pretty clear that he wants us to really think about how AI might change what we think about intelligence and even what it means to live a meaningful life.
Yeah, and he uses a pretty thought-provoking analogy to show how AI, these complex systems, can really affect the world. He compares them to gods.
Gods?
Not in a religious way, but as a way to understand how intelligence could work on a much larger scale.
So not like supernatural beings, more like the idea that intelligence can exist beyond just one person's mind.
Exactly. It's recognizing that intelligence can come from networks, from systems, from lots of individuals interacting, and he says these systems can be so powerful that it's hard to really understand their influence.
He compares these gods to viruses and pandemics, which is a really interesting comparison.
Right.
What do you think he means by that?
Well, he's pointing out that ideas or memes can copy themselves and spread around, just like a virus can infect people. You know, just like a virus can spread really fast and make a lot of people sick. Ideas can take hold and change how we think on a huge scale.
That makes sense.
Think about how information spreads online, how algorithms can actually shape what we see and what we believe.
Right.
It can feel like we're being controlled by forces that we don't even know are there.
It's a little scary to think about.
Yeah.
It makes you wonder if we even have free will or if we're really in control of what we think and do. But I don't think Bach wants us to feel hopeless, does he?
No, not at all. He emphasizes that we can still make our own choices, even with these powerful forces at play.
Okay.
He says we can educate ourselves and make conscious decisions about how we use these systems.
So it's not about rejecting technology or going back to the Stone Age. It's more about learning how to use it in a mindful and deliberate way.
Exactly. And this is part of what he calls reaching those higher levels of mental development, that enlightened mind and the transcendent mind. It's about going beyond our own egos and connecting with something bigger than ourselves.
And he thinks AI can actually help us do this.
Yes. He doesn't just see AI as a threat to our humanity, but also as something that could help us evolve.
So it's not about humans versus AI, but more about humans and AI evolving together.
Yeah. Right. And this is where I think his work is really hopeful. It's not about giving up when things get complicated, but about understanding that we have the power to shape the future of intelligence. We need to be more mindful, more intentional, and more involved in deciding what kind of world we want to create.
It's a really inspiring message. It's a reminder that we're still writing the story of intelligence, and AI is just one chapter in a much bigger story.
It is, and I think that's a great way to end this deep dive into Yosha Bach's work. It's been really thought-provoking and challenged us to reconsider what we think about AI consciousness and even the meaning of life.
It's given us a lot to think about, and we hope it's done the same for you. So to all our listeners, keep exploring these ideas, keep questioning what you think, and keep the conversation going about the future we're building together. Thanks for being with us on this deep dive in Deep Dive.